All right, welcome everybody to this week's Pluralia Dialogos, where I'm very happy to be joined by two excellent guests, fantastic geopolitical analysts. We're going to have Pelle Neroth Taylor, well-read filmmaker, author, television, or not television, I guess, podcast host, and somebody who's been a colleague of mine during our days at TNT Radio, and who has put his finger on the pulse of some major historical events for a very long time. So I always appreciate your analysis. Pelle, thank you for coming on.
Great to be here. Great to be here.
And we have our recurring guest, Kit Klarenberg from the Gray Zone. Both Pelle's work and Kit's work are going to be in the description box. Kit, you blew a lot of people's minds last time you came on. Your work is impeccable. So again, thank you for joining us in today's roundtable. There's a lot going on, obviously. We're going to be touching on quite a number of things that might on the surface appear disparate, but I don't think that they are. And I think that what I've noticed about your minds is that you're both looking for common universal principles that are shaping what appears on the surface naively to be different things. We have domestic chaos accelerating in various ways within the United States, within various European countries. False flag events there's warning signs, there's creepiness, there's a cloud that I feel that makes me nervous about things to come. Hopefully good ideas prevail, but at the same measure internationally, there's a lot of bad ideas that seem to be also accelerating towards chaos on a war front. So I marketed today's show around the issue of Charlie Kirk's assassination, the outcomes of that, how the Trump and his network are reacting to, or how either wisely or stupidly to that strange thing. And also internationally, like we see that there are protests, as I alluded to, in the UK, the United Kingdom. We've seen an acceleration of more left-wing oriented protests against austerity in France. But there's certainly things don't smell right. The official narratives don't seem to mesh with what I'm seeing as evidence. And for the first thing first, for the Charlie Kirk assassination and the reaction to that, what do you guys think? Does it pass your smell test, or are there things off with the official narrative on that front too? And I'll start with Kit on that.
I mean, where would you like me to start? I have repeatedly stated, and I'll reiterate it because it remains true. I mean, it strikes me as like a spectacularly crap tribute act to the JFK assassination. Right. So we've had the alleged confession note that the FBI found accidentally destroyed. They can't tell us how or why it was accidentally destroyed, but we absolutely found this confession from the alleged shooter. Of course, Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly kept the diary and also sent the FBI threatening notes, which the FBI then destroyed, apparently. We have had a release of a series of extremely dubious alleged conversations between Robinson and his roommate/lover, in which he claims that he wanted to keep this secret forever before then going on to admit to absolutely everything along the way, using all sorts of cop language like drop zone, squad car, which you wouldn't expect a 22-year-old electrical engineering student to deploy in an everyday conversation. And I mean, I think most crucially, like, you know, for all of the insane saturation media coverage that this has received, not only in the US, but throughout the Western world. I know people in Australia and New Zealand who say that their local media is just drowning in coverage of this event. You know, I imagine that the populations of these countries, very few people, if any, had heard of Charlie Kirk before this. You know, there is a very strange disparity between that saturation coverage and a total lack of serious evidence or even indications of a serious investigation being undertaken. You know, where is the autopsy report? Where's the coroner's report? Where's the ballistics report? Where is the footage from the cameras that were situated behind and in front of Charlie Kirk at the crucial moment he got shot? A lot of people have made the very obvious point that the kind of gushing wound in his neck very much appears to be an exit wound, not an entry wound. And relatedly have made the obvious point that if he was shot from the front, then why was there no splatter of blood behind him, as you might expect? We got an explanation from a senior Turning Point USA apparatchik, I believe it was yesterday, where they said that Charlie is just possessed of super strong bones.
I just read that.
Yeah.
Like literally 5 minutes ago. It's Andrew Colvette who put out this official statement saying that that he's endowed by what is it? He's the man of steel because his bones
Yes.
didn't break as science would expect it to, and so because he was made of essentially miraculous steel, the bullet didn't
Yes.
pass through, saving the lives of people standing behind him. It's the official message of the official Turning Point USA spokesperson about exactly what you just said. I mean, that's strange. Sorry, yeah, keep going.
No, I mean, this is how ludicrous it is. And yes, I mean, the exact wording of that statement was that his bones were super so strong that he actually managed to miraculously save lives because the bullet got trapped in his body. I mean, you know, what next? A flying pig took the blast for him, or God intervened to prevent it injuring anyone further. It's completely and utterly ludicrous. And I might add as well that, I mean, the core bit of evidence that has been released allegedly attesting that Charlie was shot from the front is this video camera footage of a roof facing where Charlie Kirk, the roof of a building facing where Charlie Kirk was speaking, which was allegedly under 24/7 surveillance. The only bit of the video that's been released is his alleged shooter fleeing. We don't see his alleged shooter setting up shop and establishing his sniper's nest or assembling and disassembling the rifle. We only see him jumping off the roof. That's very strange. There are the footage of the immediate aftermath of the shooting in the directly where Charlie Kirk was sat, where there's very clear evidence tampering with things being moved around, cameras being removed, allegedly by members of Charlie Kirk's security team. Which is, you know, I mean, that's a serious criminal offence.
Yeah.
You know, like, and I, you know, as someone who lived in crime-infested London for 30 years, I mean, I was on the scene / witnessed numerous, nothing quite so horrific as this, but like, you know, numerous vehicular accidents, stabbings, and the standard operating procedure was always to touch nothing and circle wagons until the police or ambulances arrived. You know, like it's just.
Whereas here they dismantled. They dismantled the stage within minutes.
Before
they
the
began
police
dismantling
arrived.
it. Before police arrived, right? And then even the AstroTurf, like even the grass or whatever, they replaced the grass with new AstroTurf immediately before any type of forensics could be done. And as you pointed out, strategically placed cameras just were disappeared. So many anomalies. It's so. Pelle, what do you think about this this stuff so far? How are you looking at it?
I haven't watched the Charlie Kirk thing so closely because, well, I mean, I looked at the political ramifications. I followed the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania last year very closely, and then it kind of seemed to dribble out into the sand. And I thought, what's going to happen? Why? I mean, now with Trump in charge, why is it not leading to anything? You know. So, but I was convinced by that there was something deeply suspicious going on. But just, I mean, I think that I was in London recently and I talked to a guy who's very skeptical of the Reform Party. He thinks that they're controlled opposition. And I want to highlight the fact that the mainstream media, who lie about practically everything, they made a big thing out of the Charlie Kirk assassination. I mean, not without the usual, let's say on the BBC, which is important because people believe it, not because it's telling the truth, you know. But the fact that they're talking about Charlie Kirk in the sort of reverential terms, without that kind of snarkiness or that kind of anti-far right vibe that you often get from the BBC and the mainstream media. I mean, they almost like they're paying tribute to man. They're taking him seriously, and and I thought, well, why are they doing that? I mean, where are they coming from all of a sudden? And what my source in London was telling me, I mean, I was researching what's happening with this sort of so-called insurrectionist come far right movement. He's saying basically it's all about controlled opposition. they feeling the people who brought mass migration onto Europe, rather than be held guilty for it, they're trying to control the insurrection against it in some way, and then channel it to even further their purposes. So basically, I mean, they found in the UK Reform Party a party that will do their bidding, you know, and under the guise of we have to reach out and get more votes, they're selling out, as it were. And then the deep state in the UK, apparently there's one faction of MI6 who supports Reform Party. They're going to use that to introduce digital ID, for instance, and the digital currency, because it's going to stop illegal immigration. Anyway, the point is that if Charlie Kirk is treated reverently, I mean, the point is he's in the United States. So you can safely sort of put an American figure perhaps on a pedestal, because anything that you're reporting from a foreign country removes some of the domestic issues. I mean, let's say the old Soviet Union was always reporting about, quite justifiably, I mean, all the bad things that America was doing around the outside world. And that became, foreign policy became like domestic policy, because the foreign policy became a substitute for the vacuum that exists in a domestic foreign policy. So that's what my thought about Charlie Kirk. I mean, I thought the little I saw is Israel. I mean, obviously you guys know this, but Netanyahu suspiciously, thou protestest too much, you know, is saying, well, it wasn't us, sort of thing. And then the Mossad are the great assassins of the world. I mean, if there's an assassination, look at Mossad. They boast about it. I mean, there was that book, Rise Up and Kill, by Ronan Bergman, saying that the Israelis had killed 3,000 people in the decades 1970 to 1990. And then they put sort of poison in people's toothpaste and things like that. I mean, they're incredibly creative about it. And unlike the... so I thought that's where I would first look, given the guy, and you of course have read up on this, his sort of turning away apparently from hostility to Israel's critics and so on, and I think he was a man of honor, you know. But so it could be that, and then I thought that the fact that there was that plane that took off from the nearby airport is owned by a sort of or has connections to Israel. There's a couple there that run a foundation that runs kosher food or something like that, and they're Israeli double citizens or something like that. But of course, the way I say it like this sounds as if it's a classic anti-Semitic trope. You'll find Jews all over the place, and you can kind of link them together intellectually and say it's an Israeli plot. But but why is it? Are they trying to warn Trump as well? You know, are they trying? He's apparently terrified of Netanyahu. I also heard that they would. A lot of people want to condemn Trump for doing what he's doing, but in my view is that they don't realize what he's trying to navigate. I mean, that's the Alex Kreiner's view, that he's trying to do the best of a bad situation. And if Netanyahu was going to put his goons onto Trump, you know, and he was then threatening to nuke Iran, which is one thing that Iran, if America didn't help them. So I think that, I think he hates Netanyahu. I think they really hate each other. So I would definitely look to the Israelis for that.
That is coming up more and more. I always find I'm always a bit weary when dealing with nation states in my narratives, because we know that we have these three-letter agencies that are affiliated with something above nation states per se, but have infiltrated into and have their own agenda and have their own masters that direct. You know, we see a lot of similarities between a lot of these shady assassinations, like what we saw with RFK, who was clearly the official story there. Saran shooting from the front, fails completely. Tons of evidence was brought to the surface over the years, showcasing that no, the kill shots came from behind. As you know, and even the coroner itself, who did the key work on RFK in 1968, made that point very, very clear. Martin Luther King, apparently it wasn't from the shooter from the bottom at the Lorraine Motel. It was actually a shooter far, far further removed from that. A lot of work there by Mr. Pepper was put together, his defense attorney. JFK, don't need to belabor that point, but of course you have the involvement always when you start scratching behind the official narratives of things like the CIA, of the FBI, or different branches or sub-departments within them. Mossad, definitely no exception to this rule, and we're seeing a pattern forming once again, no doubt. The issue of it's all about the effect, though. I think a lot of these assassinations, it's really about what is the effect we're getting. It's not really always about the individual per se, but like what's being done as an excuse to this person having been killed. oftentimes it is about the individual, but more so about like what policies can we justify. And one thing that concerned me, I don't know if you guys saw this, but Pam Bondi gave a interview, and here's a 30-second excerpt from it, which deals with, I think, something that's becoming known as the Charlie Kirk Act, which proposed to it's an amendment that proposes to hold media outlets, radio stations, educators, and content creators accountable for false narratives and erroneous misinformation, sounding a lot like something that had been pushed by the left for a long time, but now it's taking on a bit more of a conservative tone, but with similarly disturbing things. So this is Pam Bondi.
There's free speech and then there's hate speech. And there is no place, especially now, especially after what happened to Charlie, in our society.
Do you see more law enforcement going after these groups who are using hate speech and putting cuffs on people so we show them that some action is better than no action?
We will absolutely target you, go after you if you are targeting anyone with hate speech, anything. And that's across the aisle.
That's a little disturbing. And then, of course, you have things like Antifa being placed on the terrorist list increasingly. What do you guys think of this? Do you fear that we're going into more like Orwellian overreach here that might actually justify more recruitment towards radical left movements in response? Or is it, this is my concern. Do you guys share that, Kit?
I mean, yeah, I think it was very, very clear. Another thing that kind of made my antenna twitch rather fervently, on top of the blanket media coverage that's got around the world. I mean, there was like a minute's silence in the European Parliament over Charlie Kirk's assassination, which is, you know, a tragedy. But you know, I mean, I'm not sure that he has the necessary clout to justify that. You know, and I have a kind of, in the spirit of gallows humor, asked what next. He's chiseled onto Mount Rushmore. But I think that it's very, very clear that there was a seemingly coordinated push in the immediate aftermath of this to really, really nail this narrative of, well, this is civil war, you know, this is the left, this is the trans movement, this is Antifa, you know, they're at war with us, no one is safe. And it led to Trump announcing he was going to deploy the National Guard to numerous US cities. He was also, as you mentioned, there's been talk of banning Antifa, which is would be quite a difficult thing to do, given that it is an effectively leaderless like idea, more than a dedicated movement with, you know, varying levels of support and membership and influence across the US. There was also, yes, discussion of changing laws so US citizenship can be denied or revoked from people who are critical of Israel and all sorts of other things. But I, in the spirit of perhaps bloody-minded optimism, as we've discussed before, Matthew, that I think that actually people were quite wise to this. People could see that this was being exploited for maximum political gains, not only by the Republicans, I might add. I mean, the Democrats, who seem to have largely dropped off the radar, were very quick to say, well, that Trump's response shows the resurgence of fascism in America, and we can save you from it. You know, despite the fact they are indistinguishable on any issue of any substance whatsoever. Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of people on the right and left challenging the official narrative of what happened, who can see very clearly that this is being used to foment tensions for political gain by malign actors. And I don't think people are falling for it now. You know, I mean, we go back to 9/11, where, you know, you have a similar like completely ludicrous chain of evidence, including the paper passports of the alleged hijackers being found on ground zero when, you know, buildings made of steel and metal had disintegrated. You know, that was very effective in manufacturing consent for aggressive wars of intervention across West Asia, domestic crackdowns on dissent and civil liberties, and you know the Patriot Act, or, you know, warrantless spying, and it stoked an environment of you know, anti-Muslim hatred in the US. I don't think people are falling for it now, even if this narrative continues to be pushed. Not enough people believe it. There is suitable skepticism within Western societies, that they understand how these events, whether they are truly, freak twists of fate or false flags, are being exploited to the detriment of average people. So that was quite heartening to see, and I was surprised by some of the people who did push back against this. You mentioned Netanyahu feeling the need to make numerous public statements saying we didn't do this. He at one stage he issued a video statement, not directly calling out the grey zone by name, but quite clearly referring to our coverage and about how people in Charlie Kirk's inner circle relate to us anonymously because they're terrified, quite understandably, that Charlie in the last weeks and months of his life was genuinely worried about his, really quite minor criticisms of Israel and the repercussions that might have. Like Netanyahu, who is overseeing a 21st century Holocaust in Gaza, felt the need to make an official statement saying it wasn't us, we pumped. And so and
that was weird,
slanderously suggested that our reporting was influenced by Qatari funding, which it isn't at all. But yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that that someone who acts with total impunity in international affairs to the extent of bombing a Hamas diplomatic delegation to Qatar feels the need to make a personal statement. And Pelle mentioned Mossad, Mossad with this history of carrying out rather ingenious assassination plots with exploding pages and poisonous toothpaste. A former senior Mossad operative also denied that Israel had anything to do with Charlie Kirk's assassination and said, well, we don't do this, we don't kill people. Their motto is rise and kill first. That's their official motto. So it actually,
is that really their motto? I didn't even know that.
Yeah. That was the book that Pelle was referring to earlier. It's well worth reading. But yeah, I think that it actually shows that power is a lot less powerful than it thinks it is, and it wants the public to believe it is.
Well, may I ask a question, Matt? Sure. I wanted to talk to Kit for a long time because, I mean, do you find that there's a greater awareness than previously among the general public that these things take place? It's interesting because the BBC has started to use the phrase false flag. Obviously, it's the Russians doing false flags, but still, they kind of assume now that people know what a false flag is. And I think a lot of the things that you've dealt with over the years, the Duma and the Maidan and the Bucha and all that, they were all false flags. So if they assume that people know it, maybe, and I'm wondering, I haven't talked to BBC or a Guardian journalist for so long, if they believe what they write, Have you had I want to confront them. I mean, I was at journalism school with some of them, and I have known some of them as friends associated. I even did some work at the Guardian, but I haven't seen them for years. And I thought I'm going to point them out and say, what do you actually believe that you write? Do you really believe the Maidan story? I mean, what are these guys saying? The book's just been published about it. Anyway, because that's what I'm trying to do. We're trying to do, I think, both of us, all three of us, is to get the story, the truth out there, because we're always hunting what really happened, And the problem is in Europe, we've got a political class and a media class that mirror each other, who are leading us to hell, literally, because they're using the wrong roadmap of the world. It's a map that doesn't actually reflect what the world looks like. And I think a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think. Sorry to interrupt, Matthew. I think that's actually a very interesting point. That the term false flag has now has mainstream currency. And I mean, on the subject of Bucha, one thing that really jumped out to me was Bucha was the kind of new Pearl Harbor event that the British exploited in order to keep the proxy war in Ukraine going. It was the basis for sabotaging the peace talks that were ongoing between Russia and Ukraine at the time by Boris Johnson in April and May 2022, and they. used false claims that what happened in Bucha was a genocide in order to keep this going. Now, at the time, the BBC broadcast a quote-unquote documentary featuring their resident disinformation expert, a more apt title than I think they intended, Mariana Spring, and the British intelligence asset Paul Mason. The whole thrust of the program was anyone questioning the official narrative of events is, whether wittingly or not, feeding into Russian propaganda narratives, and therefore it is wrong to cast doubt about what the government is saying about particular events. You fast forward to, I think it was a few months back, there was the BBC published a report acknowledging that most Ukrainians now want the war over, and it referred to how only alleged, not confirmed, Russian atrocities had sabotaged peace talks. Which is like, I mean, I think that that's a demonstration again that people like us, we might understate our influence, because, you know, if we go back 3.5 years now, you know, at this point when there was zero dissent tolerated in the West on Ukraine, that this was this grand war for freedom and liberty and democracy being waged by the plucky, virginal Ukrainians against the evil, tyrannical Russians who are like the Nazis 2.0. We are so far from that now.
Yeah.
We are so far from that in every way, to the point that mainstream politicians, mainstream political parties, and even mainstream journalists aren't taking this line. And that didn't happen just by accident. You know, it happened
when I was in the UK last month, I didn't see any Ukrainian flags, any Ukrainian posters. No one. I mean, I went to several social meetings, let's say family parties, where people are completely unawakened, you know, and they didn't talk about Ukraine spontaneously. So, you know, I think
this is why I'm also a little bit surprised too, because despite the fact that there's a complete exhaustion in the general population that can't really take on any more propaganda about the grandeur of the Ukrainian freedom fighters, like it's been just ongoing, nonstop grinding in our souls now for over 3 years. Yet despite that, there are the technocratic leadership amongst European, like various European heads of state, are still doubling down, tripling down on the promise. I mean, the head of Finland just recently came out and gave this wild speech. I have a little clip of it here. Oh, I don't have the clip. Do I have a clip? Well, anyway, the head of Finland just said, you know, everybody has to be prepared to fight Russia in order to welcome in, if we're going to truly welcome in Ukraine into the NATO alliance, in regards to these Russian jets that aggressively flew into Estonian airspace. And so you have like a doubling down. Why do we have this orientation, this detachment from the leadership who are supposedly representatives of the European people, who don't seem to realize that the European people don't want to hear anything more about this? Why are they doubling down when it seems like it's pushing their own self-annihilation? Really?
Well, I'll just say something about that Stubb interview. I read the original interview in The Guardian, and he was actually, you can read that interview. If you read the whole interview, it's not like, be prepared for war. It's, if you do this, you must realize there might be a war. So you can actually read that two ways. You can say, he's saying, well, you know, this is not child's play. It's serious consequences to think twice about it. And then the Americans are probably not going to come in and help, thank God. So there probably won't be something. So it's more ambivalent than I saw the headline in the Swedish media, which was, prepare for war with Russia. Russia has no say in whether we go in or not. So, I mean, a complete traducement and simplification of that. So I thought that, I mean, Stubb is a little bit more aware maybe than we give him credit for. I mean, I thought he was a complete farce when I knew of him in Brussels when he was an MEP, you know, a complete poser. But he was, but he's very, I mean, I think he's kind of trafficked this idea that Ukraine should be Finlandized, as Finland was very successfully between 1945 and 1991, you know. But there's so many NATO people on his country, they're completely the Scandinavians, you know, these calm, peaceful, civilized people, number one in freedom of speech, number one in democracy. They're the most brainwashed people in the planet right now. So I don't know, he has to navigate that as well. I don't know what's going on, to be honest. I mean, there's a lot of I listen to all the sort of analysts, you know, the people like Mearsheimer, and everyone has their. No one can quite work it out where people are doubling down. Is it because do they know what's going on? I mean, are they being fed still this story? I think Keith Kellogg, you know, the Trump's special envoy on Ukraine, saying that the Russians are losing far more men. And I mean, a lot of other experts saying that's completely untrue. It's more like 1.5 million Ukrainian losses, 300,000 Russian losses. But of course, it's very, very dangerous if you underestimate your opponent. So I don't know if they genuinely believe that, or if they're just trying to tell the public. I think one dangerous thing is that they all meet. They're not very intelligent, any of them. And we've got a political leadership class that was promoted very quickly. You know, like, you know, people like Dominic Raab and later David Lammy and all these people, they have a few years experience in parliament, some of them, and then they get promoted to the foreign secretaryship. In the old times, they'd have decades of experience, and they'd be in their 50s or 60s. Now they're in their 30s and 40s. Or they're young women who are pretty, looking like Sanna Marin in Finland. You think, where the hell do they come from? What the hell do they know? Kaja Kallas, the foreign minister of Europe.
Yeah, actually surprised that World War II was about stopping Nazis. Or
she didn't
something.
realize that the Russians and the Chinese. Interesting. There's a new book out on the Chinese contribution to World War II. I mean, Kit and I probably grown up on the British myth, which has kind of suffused the whole of the 20th century knowledge. The Brits and Churchill, always the good guys and fighting the war single-handedly, and everything follows on from that. But the Chinese played a very, very substantial role, actually. And there's actually a new book out about that, which completely reconfigures it and looks at the Asian dimension of it. But anyway, I forgot what I was going to say. I don't know if, I mean, maybe Kit's got some thoughts about that. I have no idea. One possibility, I mean, I think that the Swedish leadership, I think they're gay. I think there might be blackmail scandals going on. You know, I mean, I don't care what people's sexual predilections are, but it's interesting that there's this scandal in the UK now, which was covered up.
Right. Yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah, there might be embarrassing things in their personal lives that might be held over their heads.
Exactly. And there's a documentary by Andrew Bridgen. I don't know if you saw it, Kit, that we're featuring Andrew Bridgen, who's a very famous whistleblower in the UK, that shows that the MI6 are trafficking people into the UK from Ukraine, boys and girls, and using that to target politicians, you know. So if you want the war to continue, you'll hold that over leading politicians in Scandinavia and the UK and say, if you don't do what we do, we'll drop this information, you know. So that could be one reason why
we know that rampant degeneracy is promoted for a variety of reasons within the political establishments of the transatlantic, especially both to hold people, I mean, as we saw with the Epstein operation, or with
that's right. It's a European Epstein operation.
Friend of mentor of King Charles, the necrophiliac, what's his name? Jimmy Savile. We saw that with
Jimmy Savile.
Jimmy Savile was a part of Sir Jimmy Savile, which was tied to a variety of boys' orphanages and other things that brought you into the upper establishment of a big chunk of the House of Lords, of members of Parliament, of judges. It was creepy, but we know that that's not just isolated to the UK. It's not just isolated to the US. It's a rampant problem culturally within the political class. Of course, there's that issue as well. Good point to take note of that. But yeah, I mean, like, what do you think of as far as like that doesn't quite still fully account, because even if you're a degenerate and you're embarrassed to have like skeletons come out of your closet into public light, that still doesn't account for why one would risk igniting the world in thermonuclear war, which does seem to be the orientation that some of the policymakers right now are pushing, both in terms of the saber rattling as far as freaking out about Russian jets flying into airspace that's like for 12 minutes, you know, and a completely, I got a picture of this thing. This is what's in all the mainstream news.
It wasn't even over their territory. It wasn't even over their territory.
No, it's the Gulf of Finland. I mean, yeah, I mean, over an island that has no habitation, nobody living on this tiny little island.
It's a reef.
Well, I mean, very few people live in Estonia as well. So, I mean, you can see why it's so egregious. But I mean, and in all seriousness, I mean, I think that there are a number of issues at play here, and I think that we'll probably get into this in greater detail in due course. But I think that the insanity of Europe's policy can be explained of doubling or tripling or quadrupling down on what is obviously a lost cause. Even Ukraine's most ardent supporters in the British media are admitting this is just lost now. It's irrecoverable. It's not the Ukraine's not going to recapture its territories. Russia's going to keep advancing. I think that there are several issues at work here, which is number one, the European elites cannot admit failure. Right, and they also, in many cases, they have people like the aforementioned moron Kaja Kallas as their head foreign policy chief. This kind of yapping chihuahua from the Baltics, who is supported by a whole supporting cast of fellow Baltic ultranationalist lunatics who genuinely think that there is a prospect of breaking up Russia, and are imbued with this kind of visceral genocidal hatred of all things Russian. But there's another aspect to this as well, which is, and it kind of ties in with what we've discussed about, race riots or civil war, etc., which is there are an enormous number of people across Europe who are really, really, really suffering, and people on superficially high salaries, people who should be by most metrics middle class, are really, really, really struggling at the moment. And the reason why can't be mentioned, because the reason is the self-imposed sanctions on Russian energy imports, right? And if you read, there have been several articles in the mainstream media and Harvard Business Review and other kind of esteemed journals about Germany's economic woes and its deindustrialization, and they invariably use evasive kind of weasel language to get to kind of divert from the fact that Germany imposed these sanctions eagerly and electively. They'll say, "Oh, well, Germany suffered an energy shock in February 2022." Oh, well, what happened? What happened there? And then there's no answer given. And I think that channeling the legitimate dissent and anger over declining living standards and spiraling living costs across the continent, channeling that against immigration, legal or illegal, and also using that as an excuse to implement digital ID and digital currencies, as Keir Starmer has openly mooted now. That's absolutely ideal. It serves a lot of purposes. They don't have to admit they got it wrong. They don't have to admit this is lost. They don't have to do anything substantive to improve people's living conditions. And they also get a mass surveillance regime through the back door. I mean, what could be more convenient than that? But also as well, and this is something I did want to bring up, is one of the interesting recent developments is that the Czechia's lead opposition party, which has a 98% chance of winning per poly market in the impending Czechia's impending parliamentary elections, their leader has explicitly stated, the second that I get in, we're going to end aid for Ukraine because our people are suffering. Right, and I might add that that Robert Fico in Slovakia was elected on that exact ticket in late 2023. He implemented it and then got shot. Right. 6 months later. In Romania, Calin Georgescu stood on that exact platform, was going to win. He's now facing jail. This stuff is unsayable in the mainstream. But there is another aspect to this, which, funnily enough, Czech authorities have acknowledged, which is the blowback from the end of the Ukraine proxy war. Whenever this nightmare ends, I mean, it could be in 6 months' time, it could be in many years' time. We don't know. But the fact that there's going to be an enormous number of people, enormous number of Ukrainians who feel stabbed in the back have battlefield experience, have easy access to weaponry, including Ukraine's vast drone teams, where they buy drones for a few dollars on Temu or Amazon and then strap explosives to them. And these people are going to want revenge. And like the Czech government recently explicitly stated, we don't want Ukrainian military veterans on our territory because they're dangerous. And right. It's like, well, yeah, they are. And it's like, you're going to have a flood of this. And it's like, I mean, my experience of speaking to Ukrainians in Belgrade, of which there are very many, they're not stupid. They can see very clearly that they were exploited as a proxy to try and weaken Russia. And in the process, a large number of their loved ones and family members have been killed for no good reason whatsoever. And that creates an enormous amount of anger. And it takes just one person with a grenade to kill a lot of people. And I think that is what the European elites are scared of. A way of preventing that from happening is just keeping this quagmire grinding on interminably.
Well, that's where it does seem like, you do have, in the case, especially of Poland, we've seen examples now where on the one hand, you have propaganda that, Poland has suffered gravely from drones, 20 some odd Russian drones that invaded Poland as a preparation for the oncoming inevitable Russian invasion of all of Europe, as far as we've been told by the mainstream media. Missiles striking Polish houses, killing people as well, have obviously been done by the Russians, says the media. But in the same time, then you have admissions like this, where Poland admits that this rocket that killed a couple of people came actually from one of their own jets, or at least it destroyed a house. I don't know if this one actually killed the people, but this one, the one that destroyed the house in Poland, did not come from any Russian plane or Russian drone. It came from a Polish jet, but Polish as well, kind of like walking in two different worlds. They're getting pulled in different directions where their economy is getting hammered. Farmers have organized to cut off the border and to prevent grain and things coming in from Ukraine, because
the Poles don't want the Ukrainians to join the EU anyway, because they'll lose all their agricultural funding. And that's one of the reasons why Yanukovych back in 2013 was taught to be skeptical of the EU, because he thought, we're going to have to open our markets, but we won't get anything in return, which is what tided the Poles over when they opened their markets back in 2003 or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of bad blood between the Ukrainians and the Poles, The Poles see themselves as the big brothers, and they're the classic aristocracy in Eastern Europe, and the Ukrainians are the most peasanty of the peasants, as it were, in terms of nations. And so they don't like them at all. They hate the Russians, of course, but they're not. And there's
even there, the head of, I think it was the prime minister who recently just said, or they passed a bill saying that the celebration of Stefan Bandera and other Azov heroes has to stop immediately. That's illegal, because they could see, they have a bit of a memory in Poland too of the atrocities of the Banderites back then, which they're having enough of that, and they're seeing their future is really compromised. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No. I mean, I traveled a lot in Eastern Europe, and it was fascinating. But there's a lot of bad blood. I mean, I think that, and it was unearthed by the end of communism in a way. I mean, all these nationalisms grew up, and I think that, I don't know. I mean, people like Anne Applebaum, for instance, she's very much taken up the Ukrainian cause, and I think she's an evil woman. And
with a terrorist husband.
That's right.
Sikorsky.
But she was part of my generation who went out to Eastern Europe. She's a bit older than me, but she was, I don't know if she's got intelligence connections, but she jumped on the Ukrainian nationalism bandwagon and did the Holodomor, which is the Ukrainian starvation thing, which actually there's been some pushback from. I mean, this guy, Robert Conquest, who's famous in the 1980s for writing books about it. Well, he wasn't relying on entirely trustworthy sources. And I remember I was invited onto a Canadian podcast to say this, and I wasn't invited on again because there's so many Ukrainians living on the prairies or whatever. Anyway, I don't know. I mean, it could be Russian propaganda. I mean, apparently the Kazakhs starved just as much as the Ukrainians, so Stalin didn't have it in for the Ukrainians in particular. Anyway, I can't remember what I was saying. Anyway, we're getting caught up in these East European propaganda wars and hatred wars. We modern 21st century Western societies, and I think the British there's a whole generation of British journalists, people like Timothy Garton Ash and so on, and Foreign Office people and MI6 people. They all know each other. They all are now at the upper reaches of British journalism and British foreign policy making. And Eastern Europe became their thing, you know. And as a result of that, the British have abandoned the Commonwealth. They've abandoned BRICS. They've all the rest of the world. The only thing they care about is Eastern Europe, and that's they're onto a loser there. I mean, just in Britain's national interests. I mean, why should we realistically? Why have we traded India for Estonia, you know, or China for Estonia? Why is this thing about tiny little country, or the Ukrainians who've got hostile relations with everyone around them? I mean, we've got mired into this endless historical revisionism back and forth that the East Europeans are engaging with each other. Eastern Europe is where wars start. You know, why are we even involved in that part of the world?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and just a quick note on the Holodomor thing, and we could do a whole show on that at some point.
Yeah.
I've also looked into that, and yeah, it smells the official story there that that Conquest pushed. It's all based on the testimonials, principally of Gareth Jones, who was the personal assistant to Lloyd George. He's part of the Roundtable movement of Milner, and then Muckeridge as well came out and started like endorsing Gareth Jones. As the only eyewitness whose journals were then used to then create this like enshrined narrative. But as you pointed out, that there was famine all over, even outside Ukraine and Russia and other parts of the Soviet Union. There was a big problem. And on that note, I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that the Western banking cartels that had concentrated in London and Wall Street were demanding that Russia only pay off its various, I don't know why there were so many debts it had to repay, but I guess it had something to do with the Bolshevik Revolution, maybe, but I'm not really too sure. But all of those debts to foreign creditors had to be paid in grain instead of gold. And so that also forced a legal extraction of foodstuffs at a time of famine. So yeah, the oversimplistic narrative there is very questionable, but it's being revived to create, I think, just that very state of psychosis that we have.
And all our East European studies departments in all our universities will be taken over by Ukrainian nationalist narratives. And, you know, so you have to believe in that. Otherwise, you're never going to. I used to think 10 or 15 years ago that journalism is one thing, that's corrupt, but academia is much better. But that's also totally corrupt. All these national securocrats coming from King's College, they're just assets. I mean, they don't have any honest analysis about the Ukraine war. They're just talking heads. I don't think there's almost no one from an official either think tank like Chatham House or from St Andrews or from King's who's giving an honest analysis. They're all flacks and shills, all of them.
Wait, you are you as optimistic or as Pelle about Canadian journalism, or do you think that he's got it on?
Well, I can only speak for my own journalism, which is impeccable. But
you're one of the best.
Yeah. Thank you very much. But I mean, in all seriousness, I'm kind of reminded in Eastern Europe and Central Europe as well of the words of Rebecca West, who wrote this excellent book about a visit to the Balkans she conducted in the 1930s. It's called the Black Lamb and Grey Falcon, and she talks about how English persons who visit the Balkans to see who is ill-treating who and are unable to accept the horrid hypothesis that everyone is ill-treating everybody else, all come back with the pet Balkan people established in their hearts as suffering and innocent, eternally the massacree and never the massacrer. But yeah, I mean, I do have as entrenched as the pro-Ukrainian narrative remains, despite the fact that the public have, you know, even people I knew who were the most kind of ardent Ukraine ultras at the start of this have now started to question the wisdom of flooding the most corrupt country in Europe with a significant and highly influential far-right contingent with, you know, all the money in the world and all the weapons in the world. You know, like they've actually started questioning the wisdom of this at long last. Yeah, like there remains a significant and highly influential pro-Ukrainian lobby within the media, within academia, and within politics. And I'm not seeing that being dislodged anytime soon, including for self-interested reasons, as I've stated, the worry that their proxies will turn on them. But I mean, equally as well, on the subject of causes for optimism, there are people are waking up to this, and I think that particularly when you compare, say, the state of cities in Western countries, particularly Britain and the US, with where you have Ukraine, which is in Kiev, where they have clean streets and a pronounced lack of homelessness, versus, say, I don't know, Los Angeles and London. People are saying, maybe we shouldn't be sending all this money abroad. And this is it was these kind of debates which fueled the birth of welfare states in the Western world in the wake of World War II, because you had soldiers on battlefields asking each other, well, if we can spend all this money killing Germans, why can't we spend this money on building schools and hospitals, etc. And more widely, we do have a crisis, a very clear crisis, not only a breakdown of the kind of the post-war social contract, but we have a crisis of confidence in democracy, which is very well founded. As I've mentioned, there are numerous examples of elections being overturned or leaders being undermined or overthrown because they actually represented the public's interests. I mean, again, to go back to the example of Fico, he was elected on a very popular platform of ending Slovakia's contribution to the war effort, which was supported by the overwhelming majority of the population. And yes, his reward was to almost be killed. In Romania, as I mentioned, the quote unquote wrong candidate was on the verge of victory, so they just cancelled the elections. There's only so much that people will take, and there's only so far that you can take this. And I mean, I think as well, when completely absent, and this is entirely by design, from any discussion of why people are suffering in Europe, is the fact that the sanctions and more generally the disruption to global trade caused by the war, the proxy war in Ukraine, that's absent from any discussion of people, of average citizens' economic woes. Now, at the Grey Zone, we've reported on the leaked files of Project Alchemy, which is this Ministry of Defence created military and British Ministry of Defence created military and intelligence cell. In February 2022. They acknowledged, while drawing up all of these insane plans to keep Ukraine fighting at all costs, they acknowledged, well, the sanctions are going to hit average citizens in the pocket pretty severely, and it's going to precipitate a cost of living crisis. Well, we see the political crisis in France. You could argue that Britain's suffering its own political crisis, where the overwhelming majority of citizens wants Keir Starmer to resign after he was elected in this landslide victory in, I believe it was it July or August last year. He's not been, he's barely been in office a year, and people just want rid of him now. Is whatever they're offering, whatever mainstream politicians are offering, and whatever they're saying, is not addressing the underlying core issues because they're unsayable. So when people aren't getting appropriate answers, they look elsewhere to people like us who actually tell them the truth. Highlight inconvenient perspectives and facts which are completely removed from mainstream consideration. And I think that they are building up a lot of bad blood for themselves. I mean, when I was writing about the coup in Romania last year, I called attention to a BBC article where about the the overturning of Romania's presidential election, where the British state broadcaster was at pains to frame the autocratic putsch that went down to prevent Georgescu from seizing power as proper and legitimate and reasonably motivated by concerns about an alleged Russian meddling campaign, that spectre we've heard so much about but seems elusive in terms of evidence. Despite that, the BBC was pretty much forced to acknowledge that Georgescu was legitimately and organically popular because he actually spoke about issues people cared about and actually offered concrete, well thought out remedies for dealing with these issues. And the BBC's piece on this rounded out with a quote from a Romanian former NATO official who said, well, by overturning the election results, we've bought ourselves some time, but there's real fury here, and if we don't do something, we could have a repeat of this. Well, yeah, they bought themselves some time, but they've done nothing to address any of the underlying issues that caused the wrong candidate to nearly win. And I wonder how much how much more road that the Western elites have left in terms of, I mean, how many elections can you overturn? How many individuals or politicians or dissident journalists can you jail or accuse of being Russian assets falsely?
Yeah, it seems like they've reached the end of that script. They've milked that thing to the bone now, and there's not much more you can pull out of that. So there definitely seems to be a shift that needs to happen because the old formula is no longer working. The old magic spells don't really have their effect anymore. So what will that be? And that actually gets me at a question. There does seem to be like this weird, what I sense is maybe like a bit of a charm offensive or a flattering attempt to try to get Trump onto a renewed Anglo-American sort of to lock Trump into this renewed Anglo-American special relationship. It's a second state visit. He just, returned back home from the UK. Certain deals were signed, tech deals, integrating Project Stargate into the UK, and Microsoft, Oracle, Google got major deals on managing an AI infrastructure, nuclear. Also, there, I don't know. Like, what do you guys think of that? Who's
well, my take on
tail wagging the dog? Is it the UK still sort of like crapping the US, or do you think that more reasonable actors are still somehow managing?
From my naive view, if you like, I mean, I don't think Trump was taken in. I think I watched like a hawk for any Trump Ukrainian commitments, and it didn't come. I think that's what the Brits want. Behind everything, behind all the pageantry, behind all the beautiful speeches, the meals, they were laser-like focused on one thing: to hook in the Americans into European security. That's what they want. I was just listening. I was doing research for a documentary about NATO and Trump and so on. And Richard Dearlove, the guy who got Britain into the Iraq War, the head of MI6, he was the head of the Russiagate campaign, which originated in London. And he was saying just in 2024, he actually said it, because I thought, well, how often do we get the principals admitting exactly what they think? Well, here he said I think it was on the Trevor Phillips show on Sky News, he said, what are the main threats to Britain? It is the re-election of Trump, because he might take us out of NATO, and he is the biggest security threat, and we've got to stop that, because we've put all our NATO eggs in that basket. So that's what everything comes down to that. And incidentally, we were talking in the intermission there about Olof Palme. I mean, he was a huge threat to the Brits, because he was going to hook in Gorbachev into this idea of a common European home, which would exclude the Anglo powers from the security architecture. So I've got documents showing that the NATO were quite involved in that assassination planning, And I thought, well, this would be interesting of the Trump world, because, I mean, Trump might also be under assassination threat from the NATO forces. Anyway, so I think the Brits were looking for, and there was a very pointed speech by King Charles saying, that old pompous ass, we stood together in two wars fighting against the forces of dictatorship and tyranny to bring democracy and freedom to the world. And he stood and he looked down at Trump, who's sitting down, and it was a very pointed rebuke to Trump, as I saw it. And Michael Wolff, who's a biographer of Trump, said, yeah, that was Trump. That was a direct jab at Trump, and Trump knew that it was direct, and had this kind of strange expressions on his face, but he didn't talk about it. Not at one point did he say, yeah, okay, we're going to give Ukraine security guarantees, or us together. I think he's totally done with the Brits. I really do. I mean, I think the thing that he's emotionally committed to is resolving Russiagate, which completely destroyed his first presidency. And Russiagate, of course, was made in London, right? So he knows he's got to drain the swamp in Washington, but he's also going to drain it in London. And I know that you, Matt, I mean, I read your books about, we think of the Brits and the Americans being defined by the special relationship, but that's a post-war thing. Actually, they're at loggerheads for much of their existence. And then the World War I started when the Brits couldn't knock out the Americans because they were too powerful. And so they agreed to knock out the Germans because they were the right size. And then they gathered a number of allies around them. So this idea of the Brits and the united by common language and common values is not true. It's anyway. No. And I know that your work, Kit, is exactly along the same lines. So I don't think that Trump was sold on it. I think he came with business deals and he says, do business, Brits, don't start wars. That was his message.
Before I
don't think he's taken in.
Before I bridge that into another topic I have in mind, Kit, did you want to comment on this as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that that actually, despite his recent state visit, the role of the British in trying to undermine Trump and bounce him into an anti-Russian stance is well understood by Trump and the people around him and hasn't been forgotten. And I mean, this is something I've written about extensively, but what you've got to bear in mind is the current proxy war in Ukraine is a direct product of British meddling. You go back to July 2014, there is an individual called Chris Donnelly I've written about extensively. He's a former long-time the British Ministry of Defence apparatchik and a former NATO Secretary General advisor who led NATO expansion during the 1990s. And in July 2014, he testified to a parliamentary committee that, Britain should take the lead on training Ukraine's fascist paramilitaries. He didn't put it in those terms, but that's what he was talking about. And he said, the reason we should do this is because the Obama administration is engaged in a pivot towards Asia at the moment, and this will refocus US attention on Europe and the Middle East, right? It was the British who took the lead, yes, in training the Ukrainian military, in really pushing for proxy war with Russia and trying to convince the US political class that this was not only a viable idea but winnable. Okay, so another reason that European elites can't let go of this is that the British, particularly, they have spent the best part of a decade trying to convince Washington that that this is viable and you should get more and more involved in this, and that the returns outweigh the risks. We've reported the grey zone on leaked emails between senior British defence and intelligence officials, where they talk about Biden's reticence and how this needs to be countered because it's dangerous. I mean, the Biden administration having crossed every self-imposed red line imaginable in terms of allowing Ukraine to strike inside Russia, providing them with particular weapons to do so, etc. I'm not sure what other reticence could be overcome at this point. But yeah, again, I don't think that Trump's people are completely ignorant of this. In the spirit of shameless plugs, I wrote about, for my website, kitklarenberg.com, Global Delinquents, I wrote not long ago about the some whistleblower testimony, which it was released by the ODNI in late July. It didn't get nearly enough attention, I feel, but it was authored by a US intelligence veteran who stated that they uncovered extensive evidence of British meddling in the 2016 election. And they were expressly told by their superiors to leave it alone. And, this is Tulsi Gabbard, Trump's pick for ODNI chief, who's releasing it, while also simultaneously cutting the Five Eyes global spying network, of which Britain is the fellow lead member alongside the US, out of discussions of Ukraine. I think that's significant and not nearly gotten enough media attention.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean,
no, that's extremely important. No, Pelle, did you want to?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, those Tulsi Gabbard revelations. I mean, this dossier that set the whole Russiagate rolling. I mean, it had the Steele dossier as an annex to it. And I believe in this theory that Gina Haspel, who's the head of the CIA later, she was the London station chief in 2014 and 16.
Twice. Yeah, which is a rare. She was regarded by London as their person. Yeah. Like MI6 viewed her as one of them.
And we can't forget absolutely that. Yeah, Christopher Steele, his boss Richard Dearlove, were also involved directly in infusing the entire Russiagate dossier.
Anthony Wood, whatever his name is, the ambassador. I mean, and then they all feed it into each other, and then they exaggerate it, and it's like Chinese whispers, and then they say reliable Western sources. I mean, what the hell does that mean? I followed Russiagate sorry.
No, go ahead.
No.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say, I followed Russiagate really closely, and I thought, this is how intelligence operations work in real time. You can see how, if you're clued into what they're trying to do, you can actually see how, like, let's say when Comey said to Trump, I'm afraid I'm going to have to report there's an investigation into you. Even though the claims were unreliable, and he said so, he relied on CNN to report that there are investigations into him, and that he relied on the CNN not to report all the caveats. And then the story's out and running. You can see how they're working these things out. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I just want to say as well that, like, Richard Dearlove has on live TV referred to me as an unpleasant little journalist, which I
noticed that. Yeah.
I regard as kind of lifetime achievement award.
I would frame that. Do you have that framed?
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I have the clip. Unpleasant I may be, but little I'm not. But yeah. But sorry, go ahead, Matt.
No, there does seem to be definitely a break. I mean, we know that the entire Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia alliance, the security alliance, is flipping out right now because they see that the U.S. is shifting its priorities. The entire that security initiative that has had like $500 million poured into it over the past 5 years, that's canceled as of this moment, as far as I could tell. The Pentagon said they will not be renewing it. So that little subset within NATO, which is extremely important for this oncoming war drive, is really compromised. There is, I noticed as well on the Azov front, actually based on the Charlie Kirk murder and what we're discussing with the grooming, the Victoria Nuland, British intel, Biden grooming of Azov. There's a connection there too. Did you guys know about that? Azov to Charlie Kirk. This is interesting. I'll just show you a couple of clips here. But so Tyler Robinson's mother posted a variety of things that she then took down, but somebody had the wits to do screen shares of her and her kid, a much younger Tommy, holding military grade AKs, automatic weapons, saying this is Amber Jones Robinson, showcasing her and her son with an AT-4 anti-tank rocket at a shooting range. This is a much younger kid. They were basically invited. This is from 2017. They were invited by Uncle Mikey, who works on a certain military base, and they were having a lot of fun. Now, who's Uncle Mikey? Uncle Mikey is that his LinkedIn page is still there. He worked up until the present, actually. This is a recent shot that happened after the Charlie Kirk murder. As a member of the board of trustees of Ukrainian Special Operations and Wounded Warrior Cossack Foundation, and formerly member of the board of directors of the Disaster and Human Radio Free Ukraine. That's it. CIA front Radio Free Ukraine. And this is a post that Mike Robinson, Uncle Mike, put out saying, I am looking for interest in hosting combat veterans and wounded warriors of the Ukrainian 3rd Assault Corps, aka Azov, between now and end of 2025 to speak about their experiences in the war, tactics, techniques and procedures, casualty care, combat effectiveness, training, drones, technology on the battlefield, and rehabilitation of wounded warriors. This will require further discussion, so let me know and we'll continue. Also looking for contacts in Canada interested in helping with visiting Canada during the same period. Uncle Mike, mysterious Uncle Mike, Michael Robinson, Azov recruiter. So you definitely have that strange part of the story, sticking its ugly head up into even something as apparently disconnected as the Charlie Kirk assassination, which
Ryan Ralphie, the second assassin, would-be assassin of Trump, he was also, you've seen in Ukraine, he had his hairdo was in the Ukrainian colors. That's died completely, that story. I don't know what happened there. I don't know, it's like Cuban, it's like all these Cubans were after Kennedy. I mean, the Cuban exile factor in these assassinations of the 1960s, they're always plotting, weren't they? And Ukraine is the Cuba du jour, isn't it?
Well, that's what makes me a little bit jarred too, because I have trust issues, and it seems like there's almost a certain amount of, we all do. That's why people are watching this show right now, because we all have trust issues. But there's a certain amount of like almost forced scriptedness, like even that weird kid that shot his parents who was recruited to the Order of the Nine Angles.
Nikita Kasab.
That's his name, yeah. And he was like driving on his way to like try to, I think, shoot Trump in order to spark a war between the US and Russia. And he was like interfacing with members of Azov and occult Nazis in Ukraine as part of his grooming and initiation. This guy's like 17, 18 years old or something, into this occult, satanic, right-wing, white supremacist Order of Nine Angles before the Feds stopped him. And it's just like, it all seems a little contrived on the one hand. That they're these direct. It's like what you were saying about the Cubans, Lee Harvey Oswald lookalikes showing up in like Mexico saying, "I am Lee Harvey Oswald, and I am working for the Russians, and I would like to really kill the president Kennedy." Lee Harvey Oswald, that's me right here. It just seems like a little bit weird with it.
No, I funnily enough made this exact point that when I wrote about Nikita Kasab, which has been rather forgotten now, which I mean is completely insane, because this was someone who was openly, according to a public domain FBI filing, coordinating with elements in Ukraine about trying to kill Trump using a drone, Ukraine's weapon of choice at this time. And he was telling his classmates, by the way, if Trump ends up dead, it will be me. And it's this is exactly Oswald's legend building in the lead up to JFK's assassination, where he's telling everyone who'll listen that he's some hardcore communist and expert marksman who thinks that the president should be killed. I mean, it's very suspicious.
Yeah,
but I mean, the deep state doesn't want the trail to be left at the. I mean, surely if they wanted to spark a war, I mean, what the Kennedy plotters wanted to do was they wanted to start a war between the Russians and the Americans, and really nail the sort of get the blame laid at Russia's door, the Soviet Union's door, but with Lee Harvey Oswald. But surely the pro-Ukrainian crowd wouldn't want the blame to be laid at the Ukrainians' door, because those are the guys they're supporting. They'd much rather want the Russians to take the blame, would they not?
They would.
Nikita Kasab's associates specifically said that they wanted this to be blamed on Russia. So,
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm with you.
Yeah. And that was the thing too, right? You had the C.J. Jackson, who was the deputy editor of Time Life under Henry Luce, the American fascist, who bought the Zapruder film and kept it under lock and key in a vault for 5 years, and was instead pushing the narrative that it was Russia that used their asset Lee Harvey to kill Kennedy, as far as trying to put fire in the fuel of the war drive back then. That it seemed like a big chunk of the deep state that Kennedy was fighting was really for at that time getting a hard war with Russia, and that didn't that was not made. That couldn't have been done without collaboration by the Project Mockingbird operatives like Luce, like Jackson, and others who were trying to hide evidence, kind of like we see today with that mysterious camera that just went missing, of things like the Zapruder film that would demonstrate that no, there were multiple shooters. This was an inside job. So there's definitely similarities, and it does seem like there is a desire to shift policy away from Russia, especially at least from the United States. I'm worried though a little bit about the Nepal situation. Maybe we can like kind of move towards that if you guys are okay with that. I know that Kit, you wrote an excellent overview of the recent regime change, and I'll call it a regime change. I know the people might think of it as a student protest movement that resulted in the ouster of the Nepalese government. Is this not also like that occurred? It does seem like NED sort of groups might have been involved in funding the student protests that ousted the Nepalese government that had formerly been an enthusiastic member or partner of China in the Belt and Road Initiative. Now there's something weird happening. Could you say a little bit more about that? And does this also indicate that there's more influence? Like a lot of people think that Trump has reined in the NED and US aid, and these are not issues anymore. But I see things like this and I worry, and I think maybe they are still issues that have not been dealt with. What's your take on that, Kit?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think that the key thing. I mean, there are two key things here, which is number one. Around this time last year, NED removed its grant database from its website, which was like this invaluable resource where you could type in pretty much any country in the world and find exactly what groups NED was funding, where, how much money they've been given, their purposes. And like, this was a very good way of tracking destabilization campaigns. Almost invariably, if a protest erupted somewhere like Georgia, and you saw, if you looked at mainstream coverage of these events and the groups named and quoted in this coverage, go to the NED grants database, 99.9% of the time, they were funded by NED, which is an avowed CIA front. Okay, so they've removed that database now, and therefore hidden the beneficiaries of their largesse. So that's something to bear in mind. But another thing to bear in mind is that the group at the forefront of the unrest in Nepal is a group called Hami Nepal. Now, this is an obscure NGO set up ostensibly to help the victims of earthquakes, which are very common occurrence in Nepal. It has zero history of political activism whatsoever, and yet played a absolutely central and outsized role in ousting Nepal's government and installing a new one within mere days. And this is a country of 30 million people.
Yeah.
Which is just over a third of the UK's population. I mean, it's not this tiny scrap of land. It's not like some Fijian island or something. And moreover, if you look on Hami Nepal's website, they quite clearly have forms of Western sponsorship. So that is legitimate grounds for asking what precisely is going on here and why. And I think another kind of billowing red flag, which a lot of people, I was kind of surprised to see quite a lot of people online dismiss suggestions of foreign involvement in this. The coup of Nepal's elected government, irrespective of its issues and the very legitimate grievances a lot of Nepalese citizens had against their government, particularly younger generations, the military has signed off on this and has effectively taken over running of the country. The army sought to include in discussions with the youth protest leaders people who are kind of local political and business figures who support the restoration of Nepal's absolute monarchy. And it's just like, why? And another point, and I posted about this on Twitter, but it does bear repeating, that like there is a little known entity called BBC Media Action, which is the supposed charitable arm of the BBC. We at the Grey Zone recently reported on leaked documents we received about their operations abroad, and they talk about how they create factual and entertainment programming, which is intended to produce behavioural change in audiences, i.e. impact how they act, how they think. And they offer examples of how, oh, well, we produced a soap opera in West Africa, which resulted in 40% of the many millions of people who watched it voting differently. Now, BBC Media Action has just 15 offices overseas. One of them is in Nepal. Why?
Yeah, that's great. And you also point out that the British Foreign Office and the British Ministry of Defense were both financial supporters with the NED of the Gurkhas Welfare Trust, which with Coca-Cola were also behind these protests. And can you say something about this woman, Sushila Karki, as well? Who's now somehow the interim technocratic controller or ruler of Nepal for the next several months, that was voted into office by some weird anonymous Discord server group. What's that about? I've never heard anything like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is really quite extraordinary. But like, so effectively, this Hami Nepal group, which is again, like, even the mainstream media has acknowledged that they were hitherto completely unknown in Nepalese politics. They elected Nepal's interim leader, and her interim rule is completely contingent on military support, which is, questionable to say the least. She was elected via Discord, which is, an online chat platform usually used by gamers, as far as I can tell. And the Hami Nepal's Discord chat app has 145,000 members. It's unclear how many of them actually voted for Karki. And that's a tiny proportion of Nepal's population. Even local supporters of the palace coup, who believe it to be legitimate and organic, acknowledge that this is like a bit problematic. To use this anonymous online poll, not using official channels, to pick their new leader. Now, Karki does have this revolutionary history, and she doesn't have any overt links to Western organizations or governments or foundations or whatnot. But what succeeds her isn't clear, and it's like, you got to bear in mind that like the USAIDs, they don't exist. They formally don't exist anymore, but their networks surely do. Their Office of Transition Initiatives, which was concerned with regime change, it's now been deleted from the web, but USAID OTI, it openly boasted on their website that we look around the world to exploit windows of opportunity in political spaces. Now, in Nepal, there is a massive political space right now. Like, no one's in charge apart from the military. And it's like, well, okay, so, that is ample grounds for NED or George Soros Open Society foundations, or this kind of, this cluster of intelligence-connected Western grant-making foundations to inform and dictate who takes power next. And I think that Nepal's position between India and China, it is of significance. I mean, you've got to bear in mind, like, to use the example of Georgia, say, Georgia is a tiny country of I think the population is about 3 million. The US was heavily involved in installing a series of puppets there over many years after Georgia's 1991 independence. And the explicit purpose was to create an adjutant for Russia on its borders. And Georgia thereafter served as a beachhead for Chechen rebel fighters to infiltrate Russia. The apex of this was the war in was it August or September 2008, where the Georgian government started shelling breakaway Russian. Ossetia and South Abkhazia. They started shelling these breakaway regions which wanted to be part of Russia. In advance of all-out invasion, which then led to a 5-day war in which Georgia's US trained, armed, clothed, and even fed military got absolutely crushed in a lightning strike. And it's like, well, we've heard a lot recently about how the US is withdrawing from Asia. Well, I mean, militarily they might be, and with good reason, because as the war in Ukraine and the twice failed US assaults on Ansar Allah and Yemen show, the US doesn't have the military might to threaten China seriously anymore. They obviously still have the networks and the capabilities to create a source of irritation and tension on China's borders. And also India's borders at a time when Trump is openly lamenting how, well, we've lost India to the Russians forever. So it's like the motive couldn't be clearer, really. And I find that the resistance of a lot of people to any suggestion that this was a Western-sponsored color revolution really quite bizarre.
Agreed. Yeah, no, and also between your work and Brian Berletic's work as well, going through this, I think that the case was irrefutable that this is not an organic revolution. But Pelle, what was your thought?
I was just going to say I'm not up on this subject at all. Except I just read an article in RT on that, and I thought, well, I mean, and they were sort of saying, well, maybe it's a result of Chinese-Indian competition. For the Chinese, it's a gateway to India, and for India, it's a protection against the Chinese. I thought, well, maybe they're just publishing that because their new pals, the Americans, they don't want to put them in the dirt anymore or something. But I also thought, I mean, as we move to a multipolar world, we'll have to realize that everybody's playing these geopolitical games, right? So it's not just the Americans doing bad things. They've done a lot. I agree with everything, or the Brits, but everyone will start doing. It's a world as a chessboard with 6 or 7 players, isn't it? And everyone is trying to position their pawns. So I don't know. I mean, there was a coup in Bangladesh, wasn't there, last year, and that was attributed to the Americans. So that it could be part of the reining in of India. I mean, the thing is, I'm going to be naive, but I mean, the Himalayas between Nepal and China might make it difficult to infiltrate there. Could be. I don't know.
Well, there's definitely, I think, the for me at least, what I look at with the. We're going to get a new system. Like the system that we've been living under, that you and I, that all three of us were born into, was sort of set up to become a time bomb. It was already a time bomb when we were born. I would say, as soon as the US dollar was severed from the fixed exchange rate, the gold reserve in 1971, and the decision was made to brainwash everybody to think that they could live indefinitely and as some consumer society cult and not produce for themselves and just somehow buy things that magically appear in Dollaramas and grocery stores without actually having the means of production. But that cheaper and cheaper labor was going to forever just do that work, that dirty work that we used to do, but we don't have to think about. That was never going to be sustainable. And I mean, the idea also that value was going to be tied to speculation on increasing types of securitized debt obligations, and that you could always gamble and make more fictitious capital based upon increasing rates of different kinds of debts, was always going to be a bubble. And bubbles pop, whether it's the tulip bubble or the South Sea bubble or whatever. Bubbles by the physics of things pop. And I think those who orchestrated that had that in mind. When I look at people like George Shultz, Kissinger, Zbigniew, the Trilateral Commission, ideologues, like they were thinking about global systems as systems, and they were looking at the art of financial warfare to get myopic people to destroy themselves. and avoid the actual arsonists above the sea. So we're going to get a new system. But when I look at like, well, what are the competing options or possibilities of what the nature of that new system is going to be? What seems to be what gives vitality to the preferred multipolar, like the healthy multipolar idea, because not all ideas of multipolar are equal, right? Some people use the words, but they mean something much more Orwellian. Other people use the words and they mean something much more based upon trusting your neighbor, working and benefiting, doing things that benefit your neighbor instead of, some Orwellian idea of East Asia, Eurasia, Oceania, duking it out forever wars to keep the masses dumb and fighting. But I think that the Eurasian cooperation front that involves, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Belt and Road Initiative, giving sort of economic vitality is a very big part of that. And I worry that elements of that type of long-term mega infrastructure project normalization that you see with what China's been able to pull off with the BRI and gaining alliances, cultural, economic, political, based upon an idea of building something for your future. That's in a bit of jeopardy. Some people think that it's still invulnerable, but I think that there's some dangers to its viability. And, whether it's in the case of Armenia, and that little section now, the Zangezur corridor, which is going to be under control of some U.S. consortium, or like Poland, which has just announced that they're cutting off the Belt and Road rail lines that go into Europe from China. That's now being cut off because, Russia, or now this. I'm weary that might be under attack in all sorts of nonlinear ways. You guys
asymmetric warfare, so small powers can do a lot of damage just by closing their borders or causing problems against the Chinese and the Americans. I guess so.
I fear that that's sort of a full spectrum thing underway right now. I don't know. What do you guys think about the
I was
whole?
just going to say my idea of the multipolar world, just to lead into, because we've got the UN General Assembly next week, and I did some work on Hammarskjöld and all that. I was going to say, because I thought a little bit about that, because I don't want a globalist world where we're run by the UN. A lot of people in my TNT show, and perhaps yours, Matt, were obsessed with this idea of the WHO running everything. My thought is we've got to have a look. Thomas Hobbes back in the 17th century said, to avoid anarchy and chaos, you just lived through the British Civil War. You've got to have a Leviathan, someone who controls all of us. We sacrifice some of our sovereignty so that we don't all kill each other. So, I don't want a UN, but maybe I see multipolar world as a kind of managed competition between different centers of power, not a hegemon like the US. But how do we manage? I'm fine with managed competition, but how can we avoid wars breaking out or even nuclear war? And maybe I see the UN as having a role, and maybe they're discussing these very things between. I think Lavrov and the Chinese talk about the UN playing a role, and we need another Hammarskjöld.
They do. Well,
I think so. I read those vibes when I read the TASS. I don't read Russian, So,
well, that's an important idea. Before we let's round it out. Let's round out this conversation with this important idea.
The Russians. I don't know. I think they have the residual folk memory of the UN as being a trustworthy organization, and they've given up on the OSCE.
I'm open to the possibility of the UN existing and playing some positive
Let's have
role,
a UN peacekeepers in Ukraine, not British. And interestingly, Hammarskjöld signed this death warrant when he abolished the idea of British peacekeepers in Suez. The British had just attacked Egypt, and then they wanted to have their own peacekeepers in place. And Hammarskjöld said no, and the British securocrats said, "This bloody Swede."
Yeah, you and I are going to talk about. I'm going to interview you. I want to talk to you about the Dag Hammarskjöld fight, his alliance with JFK, and also his murder. That's something we're definitely going to talk about.
It's very interesting, unexplored topic. But
let's do that soon. Yeah. But Kit, what do you think, Kit? A lot of I know your followers, just like all of our followers, are very suspicious, rightfully so, of the UN. Do you think that the UN could be reformed and play a positive role in a healthier system that could be brought online, or are you of the view that it should be kind of dismantled, something new should be created? What do you think?
Well, there's amazing footage of a US soldier during Operation Black Hawk Down when US forces were posted under a UN mandate to Somalia, where he's interviewed by there's this US soldier with this kind of Wayne's World accent, interviewed by the BBC, where he talks about how, like, you know, the UN is a US puppet, and, you know, we foot the bill for the UN will vote how we want it to vote. It's an irrelevance. I think there is a huge space for the creation of a new, like, you know, international dialogue forum, and that appears to be the direction BRICS is moving in. You know, like, you know, let's resolve differences through dialogue, through discussion, not gunboat diplomacy, which is all the West knows, actually. And and you know, this is actually how the UN was one of the reasons that NATO supplanted the UN in the 1990s, was the US felt it wasn't sufficiently belligerent. Like, you know, in Bosnia, not far from where I am, they deployed, the UN deployed a vast number of peacekeeping forces from different countries. They had absolutely zero impact on the reality on the ground whatsoever. They just recorded people killing each other. I actually think that the space for, yes, constructive dialogue between on, you know, issues of agreement, issues of dissent, and deviation is massive. A lot of people want this, you know. I mean, loath as I am to quote William Churchill, you know, jaw is always better than war. You know, like, you know, let's hammer out let's hammer out our differences in constructive dialogue, and we have, you know, examples in recent history of this happening. I believe it was in 2015 when like the Turkish shot down a Russian military jet in Syria, and there was a lot of fears that this could lead to, you know, a protracted conflict. The reality was, Erdogan sat down with Putin. They had a talk. They worked it out. And, you know, like, there was relatively constructive relations between the pair thereafter. It's not difficult, you know, if you approach international affairs from this perspective, which is what the Russians and the Chinese and other players, and particularly Brazil, you know, are pushing. You know, it's like, let's not respond, even if we are, you know, harmed somehow in international affairs. Let's talk about it. Let's try and work it out like adults. You know, I think there's been a lack of that, because we have had 25 years plus of a unipolar world where the US is used to resolving its issues by just dispatching aircraft carriers to points of conflict and saying, yeah, we're going to bomb you unless you concur with what we're saying.
Yeah,
you know, and I think I would also, I mean, beyond any state consideration, I think that's what, you know, average people want.
Yeah,
you know, and I mean, if you and just to round this out, on a topical note, you know, like, the outsized and overly influential yet small fascist component of Ukraine aside, you know, Ukrainians consistently, if you look at polls throughout the post-Maidan period, they wanted the conflict in Donbass resolved by dialogue and negotiation. You know, like, Zelensky, as amazing as this sounds now, was elected on a peace platform of implementing the Minsk Accords, and bringing the conflict to an end, in an amicable manner. And that's what the Russians wanted as well. You know, both on a both on a public and governmental level. It was Anglo-American belligerence that led us to where we are now, and
that's really why the rules-based orderistas, that's why they hate populists. At the end of the day, the populists are simply people who are doing what the popular demand would like. Most people want popularly to have peace, to have a job, to be able to have a good family, to not be afraid of war, starvation, having their world burn up around them. That's just popular. And these technocrats disdain that completely.
Yeah,
So
well,
of course,
Goering
be
famous-
radicalized.
I mean, sorry, just to round that again, just to round out this point. I mean, it's like JFK when he gave a remarkable speech where he talked about peace and detente between the Soviet Union, is that we're all human beings, we all cherish our children's futures and we're all mortal. Like what disputes do we have over these basic, essential, fundamental points of agreement? Naught. It is consistently, and I think that this has come up in Pelle's work as it has in mine. It is consistently belligerent voices saying, screw negotiations, let's just go for the most belligerent stance possible, that has set us back an enormous amount. We would be living in a very different world if FDR's vision of a world governed by spheres of influence between the Soviet Union and the US had prevailed. We would be living in a very different world if Dag Hammarskjöld and his conception of the UN as a kind of global parliament for ironing out disputes and issues had gone ahead. The fact that this didn't go ahead, again, is very deliberate. And we must ask ourselves why. I mean, why. But
his ideas were, I mean, they were it's incredible. You can Google the oh God, I've written a book about it, I can't forget. But basically there were plans between Soviet and American officials to actually do away with national armies and have the UN as a global policing force. Now that sounds ridiculously idealistic and maybe it wouldn't have happened, but there were these ideas floating around in the air. And of course, it would have given a lot of power to Hammarskjöld and a lot of imperial powers. The Brits were totally adamantly against this because they still had colonies and so on. But there were some idealistic elements of the American administration. I mean, don't forget, these are people who wanted to create a new world, the new frontiersmen. So they're not totally against it. And I think it was this jaw between the Americans and the Russians that kind of cut out the lesser powers, of course, and the most jealous ones, the most powerful of the lesser powers of Britain and France. But you just put a guy's name up there, and I just want to say, if you can Google my name, and my homepage will come up, and then I've got some links there. I'm working on a film with a couple of people called Dag Hammarskjöld, the film. The trouble is, it's so hard to spell that a lot of people get it wrong. But it's daghammarskjöldthefilm.com. But you'll find links to my book, which is a very, very detailed discussion about Hammarskjöld and what happened. Because he died like 64 years ago on the 18th of September, just when the United Nations General Assembly, which was going to thrash all these ideas out and might have changed the global system, put the UN in Berlin, put UN blue helmets in Berlin, and we maybe wouldn't have had the wall and all this sort of 28 more years of Cold War.
What year was this that he died?
He died in September 61, and the Berlin crisis. I mean, just to say my little thing here, there's a lot of Hammarskjöld books out there, but literally none of them talk about the big crisis that was going on at the same time, which was Berlin. The Berlin crisis was bigger than the Cuba crisis because the East Germans were going to close the borders between West Berlin and West Germany. And the NATO said, we're going to force our way through if you do that. And that was so we were teetering on the edge of World War III. And that's why these proposals were coming up, And it's and amazingly, I mean, they're coming to head because the wall was built in August 61. August and September 61 are the two most tense months in the history of the world, probably. And Hammarskjöld had to go and sort out this problem in Congo, which had a civil war. And the Brits were going to let the city of Ndola, which is in British Northern Rhodesia, be the place for negotiations. And he was killed just before he landed. And I think it was probably French mercenaries or something. But the British looked on and let it happen because they had 20 jet planes on the tarmac. Sorry.
That's just a few months after Lumumba had been killed, right?
That's right.
Yeah. January of 61.
That's right.
Right.
Absolutely. So it's part of that. I think Hammarskjöld was partly motivated out of guilt for Lumumba because he was very close to the Americans and he tended to do what the Americans wanted. But then he realized that he needed the Soviets on board. The Soviets wanted to get rid of him. He needed to be as friendly with the Soviets as he was with the Americans if he was going to be allowed to get his UN blue helmets in Berlin. And that meant getting the Brits worried that he was a secret closet communist. I mean, Macmillan was the prime minister, said this guy's a bloody communist.
Well, I mean,
So-
like
no.
Pelle. If you're worried about people struggling with Hammarskjöld's surname, I'm giving you a provisional title for your film, which is The Dirty Dagson.
Yeah, well, dag is the way to get around the spelling.
You can have that one for free.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you, Dirty Dag. All right.
Guys, this is good. I really appreciate this, and I really appreciate the positive note as well, because I think that a lot of people, they get a little cynical and black-pilled when they look and map out the structures of corruption and evil. And it's and they lose sight of the fact that we're here right now. We're having this conversation not because the oligarchy was bored and gave us at different times in the past freedoms and new technologies and other things. No, all of these advances happened through a fight, and that was one that was morally and intellectually motivated by an ideal that humanity is made better than this. We're made for something more than adapting as animals and under a zookeeper for empire, or some sociopathic zookeeper that wants to keep us in controlled states of chaos and division. So there's something else that has been animating our history that too many people lose sight of. And without that, we don't have an ability, I think, to creatively look into the future, because we are living in history. This future historians are going to look back and decide and make judgments on what we did or did not do, and what ideas we tolerated at this moment that might become dark age crisis, a cataclysm for future generations, or we might be on the verge of something really good, something where we get our heads out of our collective asses and start looking towards the future with creative, optimistic eyes, with an understanding of the nature and techniques of evil, which I think you guys have done a great job at showcasing and helping to solidify people's minds and empower them to navigate through this minefield. So thank you both so very much. I appreciate this immensely. All of the links to your works, to Kit Klarenberg's amazing Substack, which everybody should subscribe, get the paid upgrade. Pelle, I don't think you're on Substack. You should get on Substack.
Yeah, I will. Yeah. But check out my homepage and just Google.
Yeah, your homepage will be there with links to all the Dag Hammarskjöld work.
Great.
And you and I, Pelle, are going to organize a dialogue about specifically Dag very soon. I think the auspiciousness of the UN General Assembly meeting is a very good one.
Yeah.
So let's do that. And for everybody listening who would like to be on in about 1 hour, I'm going to be hosting Caleb Maupin of the Center for Political Innovation, who's going to go through a lecture on how the Trotskyists became neocons. Which is going to be a fun conversation with an interactive dialogue. So send me a message or go to the description box under this video to check out that lecture if people are bored in about an hour. So with that, thank you guys so much. And in 2 weeks, we'll see all of the audience again.
Great evening. Thank you so much. Bye, Clip.
God bless you, Matt. God bless you, Pelle.
All right.
Take care.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.